Welcome to the television program of A Journey Through NYC Religions. Today we're going to talk about the Catholic Church. According to A Journey statistics, about 36 to 40% of New Yorkers identify themselves as Catholic. Half of those are Hispanic Catholics. To help us with our task today, we have Chris White, a reporter for the magazine Crux. Welcome to A Journey, Chris.
Great to be with you, Tony. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit, and tell our audience a little bit about what is Crux and why should we pay attention to it?
Well, Crux is one of the most read Catholic news sites in English around the world. We cover the global Catholic Church, but with a real focus on things in Rome. We sort of consider that to be our center of gravity. And in my capacity, I'm the U.S. correspondent, so primarily covering the U.S. Church. But we like to sort of, keep our eyes of all the developments happening around the world.
Well, one of the developments that happened just today is that the Academy Awards nominations came out. And the two actors from the Netflix film, The Two Popes, were nominated for Best Acting Awards. Can you tell us a little bit about those two and
Sure.
what did they do on The Two Popes?
Yeah, so today actors Jonathan Pryce and Anthony Hopkins picked up Oscar nominations for their roles in The Two Popes. Jonathan Pryce plays Pope Francis, and Pope Benedict is portrayed by Anthony Hopkins. And this is a fictionalized account, so it's important to note that this isn't based on historical fact. But the film sort of imagines a scenario when then Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who was then the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, that he travels to Rome to ask then Pope Benedict to accept his resignation. And in the process of this 2-hour film, which is largely conversational, they talk all about issues surrounding church life today and pastoral concerns. And I won't spoil anything, but you get to see sort of the various tensions. There are areas of agreement and disagreement. Again, it's a fictional account, but it sort of posits these two very different personalities and kind of get a glimpse behind the curtain as to sort of how things are run at the church.
But they did agree on some things?
They did agree on some things, yes. These are two figures that have vastly different approaches in real life and certainly different areas of emphasis. But these are figures who are both sort of priests and bishops in the Roman Catholic Church, and so you will find many areas of agreement.
One thing that's in the news lately, and you covered some of this, is about the question of the priesthood, the role of women, and our priests to remain male and single. Mm-hmm. And I believe that Pope Benedict just came out with a book on that.
Yeah, so he's co-authored this article that is being used as a chapter in this forthcoming book about the importance of, in his view, the necessity of priestly celibacy. This book comes at a time in which Pope Francis is considering sort of opening up the priesthood to married men in a specific geographical region, that of the Amazon region, due to the severe priest shortage there. And so this is a new development, and where we as reporters are awaiting Pope Francis to make a decision on this.
Did Pope Emeritus Benedict say that shouldn't be done, or he just talked about laid the theological principles down?
Well, he mainly focused on theological principles, and it's been emphasized that he has done so in sort of obedience to the Pope, saying, I'm no longer the Pope is Francis. The main thing that Benedict doesn't want to be lost is the idea of the priesthood being that of one of sacrifice, predominantly, as he sees it, being through the sacrifice of celibacy.
Now, one of the things we know that you've done, you have met Pope Francis.
Yes,
in fact,
many times. So.
we caught a photo here of of whispering in the ear of Pope Francis. What secrets were you exchanging with him?
If I told you, I'd have to kill you.
Oh my gosh!
They will remain as pontifical secrets.
Oh, that's too bad. We thought we could really break the story there. The man behind the Pope.
The seal remains.
Or the Pope behind the media.
Exactly.
Well, I know that you met him last spring, and that must have been a really special occasion. Because you're sort of a fan of Pope Francis.
Yes, I cover the church objectively, but as a Catholic, I
Oh, come on! I see the gushing between the lines.
as a Catholic, I am very excited about Pope Francis.
Well, if you could sum him up in one word, what would you use?
Well, I mean, I'll use his own vocabulary, which is mercy. From the very first homily that he gave, right after he was elected as Pope, he gave a homily in a small church, the Church of Santa Anna, which is a church inside the Vatican, and he said, "The name of God is mercy." And time again, that's sort of the theme that he's come back to in his papacy. I think he entered the papacy in 2013 very well aware of the fact that from the outside world, the church is viewed as a rigid, antiquated, often seen as a backwards-looking institution. And Pope Francis wanted to reorient the papacy to focus on the margins and the downtrodden and those that are often looked over. And in doing so, he has said that mercy is the best medicine to reach them and bring people into the church.
So, is that what you were whispering in your ear? Mercy.
Oh, I may have mentioned something about mercy, but the rest of the contents of that conversation are under papal secrecy.
Just can't weasel that out of you. But maybe I can weasel out of you as what's the relationship between President Trump and Pope Francis?
Well, the two have only met once. They met about just over 2 years ago at the Vatican. This was on one of President Trump's first big international trips.
They met. We're in the Vatican. Is there a meeting place for all these dignitaries?
When the Pope meets with the head of state, he meets in the Apostolic Palace, which is, if you're in St. Peter's Square, that great, magnificent site. The Apostolic Palace is right there to the right of the Basilica.
Right.
And up on the fourth floor is where the Pope greets heads of states traditionally.
So what happened at this meeting?
Yeah, so they met for about half an hour, and reporters aren't allowed to be there for these
But what
meetings.
did he really say?
What did he really say? That's the big question. Look, when the Pope meets with the heads of state, and he does this, almost every week, if not every day, some weeks, the Pope's emphasis is not to focus on where there's conflict, but to say, what can we do together? And both President Trump and Pope Francis have really talked about the need to sort of shine a spotlight on anti-Christian persecution around the world. So that's a theme that they spoke about at length at that meeting. Both the President and the Pope afterwards sort of attested to that. But the Pope also uses these encounters to really sort of drive home things that he's passionate about. And so, he gave the Pope a copy of his letter Laudato Si, which is his big document about the need to care for creation and where he's trying to call, for global action on the environment. They also talked about the plight of refugees and migrants around the world and what can be done about that. And so, these are personal encounters, but with a pastoral intent.
Did President Trump say anything afterwards that gave an indication?
As he is wont to do, he tweeted about the meeting after, he praised the Pope, and there had been a lot of speculation in the lead up that it'd be fueled by animosity. But both of them had very positive things to say about the encounter, and he's expressed on a few occasions his willingness to host the Pope if he wanted to return to the United States. I don't think that's going to happen, but that offer is on the table.
Well, now some people say that the Pope coming from Argentina has an ambiguous attitude or relationship to the American church and to America specifically, U.S. capitalism and democracy and so forth. Is that true, or has that been changing, or it's still unresolved where we're going with that?
Yeah, so when Pope Francis visited the United States in 2015, he went to Washington, then came here to New York, and then went to Philadelphia. I was here for just over a week. was his very first time in the United States, which is pretty remarkable at age almost 80 at the time. He had never stepped foot in the United States. And so he was the first to tell you my understanding of America, of the United States, is indirect. On the plane back to Rome after he left Philadelphia, he was asked, what did you think of the U.S.? And he had nothing but positive things to say. He emphasized, that I love the American church. And he said, he invented a word that doesn't really exist in Italian, that he sort of made up, merging two words together, but basically sort of to describe the energy that he felt in New York specifically.
Yes, by the way,
ecstatic and out of control.
By the way, audience, he was stuck down in Philadelphia, but the only city that the Pope mentioned flying back to Rome was New York City.
It's true, it's true. So I was, the whole lead up to the Pope's, the end of his trip was for what was known as the World Meeting of Families, which is this big Vatican-backed event every 3 years,
yes,
focusing on family life. And that was taking in place in Philadelphia the whole week. So I was there sort of doing a lot of the sort of talking and interviews that week, and then of course I got to spend some time partaking in the papal events once the Pope arrived in Philadelphia.
Well, I remember that, and you gave some direction to reporters. But it came across my mind that you live here in New York, but you're not from New York originally, right?
That's true. I grew up in South Carolina, so I've been here for 15 years. So I think at this point I count as a New Yorker.
You think yourself as a New Yorker?
I think so, yes.
And you also didn't grow up Catholic, did you?
No, I grew up. I was born into a family that was Pentecostal, so I was a Protestant, and when I moved here for college in 2005, it was for me an open season, if you will, to explore my faith on my own terms, which led to a lot of church hopping in the very best sense of it, where I got to explore all of New York's great churches and traditions. And through a long story that would require a whole other segment, I was actually for a bit studying abroad in Paris, and that's sort of where I became introduced to the Catholic Mass and the Catholic liturgy, and then in 2009 converted to Catholicism.
What was the most influential thing that started turning your heart and eyes toward Catholicism?
Really the beauty of the Mass and getting to understand the liturgy. I would go to these magnificent churches in Paris and a different church every week, but I experienced the same liturgy, and I really was drawn into sort of the Eucharist, which is, of course, at the center of the Catholic liturgy.
Did you ever have a chance to read over Urs von Balthasar's Theology of Beauty?
I have read some von Balthasar, not nearly as much as I should, although von Balthasar was certainly an influence to Pope Francis as well.
That's right.
So you can trace that in some of his own writings and sermons today.
He's really one of the most important writers on the spiritual aspects of beauty and art. We have a lot of not so beautiful things happening in the world too, and one of them
and in the church.
And in the church, and one of the things we have, and we'll get to some things in the church too in a moment. The number of hate crimes against religious groups has just skyrocketed. Between 2014 and 2018, the number of hate crimes nationally against religious groups has gone up 35%. We know that one of the shooters down in, I think it was South Carolina, they said, "Why did you pick this particular church?" Well, he said, "Well, I hate all churches." So he actually had a sort of a double agenda, race and anti-church. And unfortunately, that's not... There is sort of the war of all against all, and I want to ask you a little bit about why you think this is happening. The NYPD reports that the number of anti-Semitic hate crimes has risen to the highest level in the city in modern times. The New York State reports that the amount of religious discrimination cases on the workplace have risen to an all-time high. What do you think is going on here?
Yeah. Well, first, I'll just say, I'm a reporter, so I cover it. I don't have to solve the...
and well, you can substitute those secrets that you talked with the Pope about.
Right. Now, what is going on? I mean, we really have, I think, in our society, a crisis of solidarity, a crisis of love, where we really are lacking love for neighbor. I think, there are a number of sort of causes for that. I mean, you see just communities growing apart, families growing apart, and because of that leading to sort of, in some cases, animosity, as we've experienced. And not to just harp on the Pope, but I think, the Pope has been useful in sort of diagnosing this, and saying, we need this language of mercy, and not just in political life, but in our home life, so that we can kind of come to see our neighbors as not the other, but as a brother and sister.
What have the New York Catholic leaders and churches done to try to overcome this anti-Semitism and anti-religious feeling out there?
So right after the turn of the year, there was a massive, by some counts, up to 30,000 participant march that went from Lower Manhattan to downtown Brooklyn, that brought together all sorts of interfaith leaders to stand with the Jewish people and to say, when there are attacks on the Jewish people, it's an attack on all of us. Present at this protest march was Cardinal Timothy Dolan, the Archbishop of New York, Brooklyn's Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio, and they both sort of offer their own testimonials of how, in their own lives, the Jewish people have been brothers to them, and they were there out of obligation to say, no more.
It's specific testimonial?
You know what? It was great. Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio in Brooklyn talked about, growing up in Jersey City, his grandfather was a tailor, or a barber, sorry. And at the tailor next door, the Jewish couple, they didn't have children, and sort of adopted him as their own grandchild, buying him holiday presents, taking him out, just for, treats throughout the year. And he says, I'm here today to stand to honor their memory because they adopted me as their grandchild and I owe this to them. So it was really special to hear that own testimonial. Cardinal Dolan, of course, spoke about just his own sort of experiences over the years of joint ecumenical work with interfaith work with Jewish leaders. And he's been on the front lines of that for a number of years, working hand in hand. And he just said, the Catholics, as Pope John Paul II once said, view the Jewish people as their older brothers and sisters in the faith.
What are the local parishes doing something also that follows their example? Or?
Well, I mean, for starters, a number of parishes brought their own groups to participate in the Solidarity March. I've heard of some parishes. One of the things that the Catholic Church has focused on a lot over the past year is race relations, and improving race relations. And I suspect, last year the U.S. Catholic bishops collectively spoke on the issue of race for the first time in over 40 years. They issued a major pastoral letter. And one of the things that sort of come out of this is a lot of listening sessions. I know in the Diocese of Brooklyn, there were, I want to say, quarterly listening sessions over the past year. They sort of served as a town hall for people just to talk about, what remains in terms of obstacles on this front. The same has happened here in Manhattan.
Inside the parish halls.
Inside the parish halls. Again, there's a long, long way to go, but these are some of the practical things that are happening.
Bishop DiMarzio also was given an assignment to deal with the continual aftershocks of the sexual abuse scandals. And he was sent up to do some research up in Buffalo to see whether the sex abuse scandals were being handled properly, and that really created a sort of a lot of news and I guess an earthquake up there. What happened? What did he do?
So the Bishop of Buffalo, now former Bishop of Buffalo, Richard Malone.
Did he retire or resign?
He resigned. Now, I'll give you the tick-tock of how this played out.
Okay.
So for over a year, there have been complaints within the Diocese of Buffalo that the bishop had been actively covering up part of the diocese's history on abuse, covering up for priests that had been either found guilty of abuse or at least had charges brought against them. For well over a year, there were a number of cases, and then two of his secretaries came forward as whistleblowers to sort of raise questions about his handling of cases. That led the Vatican to step in and intervene.
Actually, Pope Francis himself.
Pope Francis himself, and as a part of that intervention, tapped Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio of Brooklyn to go up to Buffalo DiMarzio went up to Buffalo, spent, I think he had 3 visits over the course of 30 days, interviewed over 80 people to sort of get a sense of what was happening there, and he submitted a report to the Vatican of his findings from within the diocese. And then a month after that, the bishop, Richard Malone, submitted his resignation to the Pope, which the Pope accepted.
Now,
And now there is an interim bishop that has been named, Bishop Scharfenberger, who is the Bishop of Albany, is now also serving as the Bishop of Buffalo until a full-time replacement is named.
now I'm real curious. Why did he name Bishop DiMarzio to go up rather than Cardinal Dolan?
Well, there was speculation that it might be Dolan that would go up there. I'd say it kind of, I think it ultimately was something that just had to do with practical concerns, which was that Dolan was traveling quite a bit and didn't have that window of time when it was needed to go up there. Bishop DiMarzio is 75, on the cusp of retirement himself, and I think it was understood that he had more flexibility in his schedule. Also, a trusted figure, and so they sent him up there. Bishop DiMarzio himself has a pretty strong record on abuse. He was one of the first bishops when he was Bishop of Camden back in the day to implement some really sort of innovative procedures for responding to victims and sort of training parish staffers. And this was in 2002, or before the 2002 wave of the crisis.
Right.
And so, he's sort of been looked to over the years as sort of a point person on these issues.
Many people may not realize also that Bishop DiMarzio has a doctorate in social work.
Exactly, yes.
I mean, this is exactly the type of thing that he has an interest in and has a background in, and so he has some sets of skills that Cardinal Dolan is not as inclined to. Of course, they all have pastoral skills,
Yeah.
but this one is certainly social. But when he brought this report to the Pope, to the Vatican, and there was this rather sudden resignation of the Bishop of Buffalo, then supposedly an altar boy that was had been an altar boy for Bishop DiMarzio in Camden or back in the 70s.
In Hoboken, actually.
Hoboken.
Jersey City, sorry.
Jersey City, that's right. It was Jersey City. I said, oh, well, he abused me.
Yes.
And tell us a little bit about that. And as I understand it, that they were going to open an investigation. But tell us where all that stands.
Yeah, it's a peculiar sort of situation there. As you mentioned, this altar boy alleged that when he was a young teenager, that he served for Bishop DiMarzio during a certain time window. I believe it was the mid-'80s, and he claims that the bishop abused him on several occasions. DiMarzio strongly denied those reports. He said, "Never in my life have I been."
It was really strong.
In really strong terms, and a number of those same altar boys that served at that same time period also sort of issued their own sort of statement saying, we had nothing but positive experiences with him. The AP reported this back in November. That once New Jersey's window opened for sex abuse lawsuits for what's known as a look-back window for the next year, where they could.
The deadline was in December, right?
It opened up in December.
Okay.
That this alleged victim said he would be filing suit. That still has not happened, and so many people suspect that it will not come into fruition.
I just want to do a footnote here on Bishop Scharfenberger, who is New York born and bred. He was born in Brooklyn. He was educated in Queens and also in Manhattan.
Yes.
So we're sort of happy, I guess you might say, that he's up there having to be temporary in charge of Buffalo and sort things out.
That is plateful.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about him, just shortly, and is he the one to do the job?
Yeah, he always sort of thought of it as sort of a moderate bishop, not particularly known as being particularly conservative or liberal, just sort of a moderate bishop focused on pastoral concerns. Really interested, up in Albany, one of his signature programs is he's focused heavily on prison ministry. He's not the type that goes out picking battles within the church in terms of pastoral issues. Really is in this sense a Francis bishop, the sort of focus on, how can we get people in the doors of the church. Interesting figure. He has both a degree in canon law, so the church's law, but also, an actual JD from Fordham. That experience is tremendously helpful in this moment in the Catholic Church, in which so much of the task of a bishop is to navigate his diocese through a lot of legal minutia.
Also, finances.
Oh my gosh!
Some people say, well, maybe they'll go bankrupt up there, and he says, no. Well, what do you think?
He says the diocese could last at this rate another year at least. But it just depends on how many lawsuits are filed over the course of the next year.
Now, you yourself often report on those people that are overlooked, doing work that's overlooked.
I try, yes.
And do you do that every year, have a feature on that, or did you just do it for last year?
The past few years, I've sort of, when I do a look back, sort of say,
Yes.
who are we forgetting? Because the leaders, typically the folks in collars, are the ones in the spotlight. But I often try to say, who are we forgetting about that are really doing the hard work?
Well, this year, who should we be paying attention to that are overlooked?
In the year ahead? Well, I mean, look, religious sisters, nuns are often the ones in the trenches doing the work that doesn't get the glory. They aren't out there doing the interviews. They're there helping people, and that's a really remarkable work. I think we're going to see some really creative stuff coming out from my pal Molly Burns. Molly, she's a complete whiz. She was awarded a prestigious prize by the UN last fall for.
This is the woman who maps all of the structures of the Catholic Church around the world.
Exactly.
For environmental purposes and
Not
other.
Not just environmental purposes. Her job, or her mission, if you will, is to take every property that the Catholic Church has holdings on across the globe and sort of digitize them so that just you or myself could sit in our own apartments and look up and understand the assets of the church. And so part of that is driven by environmental concerns. Part of it is driven by financial concerns to sort of promote transparency so that people know what the church actually has in terms of.
You can go to her website and see.
It's all open source. It's
Molly, how do you spell her name?
Burhans, Burhans.
Now,
and the organization that she founded is Goodlands.
Is she still in Connecticut? Or
she is in Connecticut. She's 30 years old and was named as one of the sort of top young people under 30 by the UN just last year.
Yeah, real whiz. And of course, we love that.
And folks in the Vatican are absolutely in awe of her. And, she goes over there and these top secret offices, and they open up their doors to her.
Well, we have so much more to talk about the Catholic Church. It's so large in New York City. It's so interesting, and such powerful personalities and good work doing in the trenches. We thank you that you could come share with us today.
A pleasure.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Tony.